Yeah, and it's nice to be back in the old venue as well.
I was a little more home.
Yeah, it's like very busy in the background.
Yeah.
Could you start sitting down? And we'll start taking. Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session 2 out of 3 of the seminar talking about pricing water. Yeah, we're happy that you could all join us online and in presence. We'll give you a short introduction about the first session that we already had, then what we talk about today in this session, and then also an outlook of session 3 that will be right after this one in the music room. I'm Mona Wolf. This is my colleague Shrishti. I'm normally a project manager within the Standards and Pricing Unit of Fairtrade International, where we seek to bring social, economic, and environmental benefits to producers, addressing the challenges of poverty and sustainable livelihoods. But today I'm here as my role as a young scientific program committee member of SIWI. So we both helped organizing this event together with our conveners and Victoria and Hank. And yeah, we're very happy to say hi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Srishti, and I'm an economist with the Central Pollution Control Board, Ministry of Environment in India. And I'm also a researcher with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. To give you a short summary of the session 1 that we had last week, it was all about exploring the dimensions of valuing water and the principles and the challenges including the ones that are not very quantifiable, especially in the context of finance and water, and the relationship between costs, price, and value. And the approach that we had from the Valuing Water initiative was to institutionalize the learnings, identify the next steps, and how to scale it up.
Yes, and in this session, we will dive into the details of the pricing water debate, its rationale, its limitations, and as a policy tool for 3 sets of water usage. So for agriculture, industry, and domestic use. And we'll do that through presenting 3 case studies by our speakers, and then followed up by a panel discussion. So for the online audience, you can post your questions in Pathable as we go. And for our audience here in presence, we just ask you to hold it for the end of the panel debate, where we will have time to address that. So session 3, that will be afterwards then, will tie all of this together and place pricing within the wider value framework, and also address the role of pricing as an input for the UN 2023 Water Conference. And yeah.
So now we have Xavier Lefebvre, who would set the scene for session 2. Xavier leads the work on water in the OECD Environment Directorate, and the program of the work aims to support governments for the design, implementation, and financing of policies that contribute to water security and sustainable growth. Xavier joined OECD in 2004 and has coordinated the recommendation of the OECD Council on water, which captures OECD policy guidance on the management of water resources, water supply and sanitation services, and water-related risks. He holds a PhD in social and political sciences from the University of Cambridge, UK.
That's all from our side. We hope you're going to enjoy the session as much as we'll surely do. And with that, over to you, Xavier.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mona and Srishti, for the introduction. Thank you also very much actually for your very active support throughout the preparation of the seminar and the 3 sessions. We know the value of the young professionals in the process, so that's really appreciated. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see a full room. Well, it's great to see a room and a meeting room. The last 2 years have been frustrating, so we're very happy to have you here on a Monday morning to talk about pricing. Congratulations. As Mona and Srishti said, so this is the second of a series of 3 sessions. During session 1, we were exposed to the multiple values of water. The focus was on the financial perspective, so how water affects the value of financial assets, but also how financiers value water. Today, this morning, we will very much focus on pricing and pricing instruments that can reflect the value of water. To start the discussion, I would like to offer a distinction between 2 pricing instruments. One of these instruments that can reflect the value of water is tariffs. The tariffs we pay for a service. And there is another instrument which is fairly different, which are charges. Think about abstraction charges or pollution charges, which are economic policy instruments to reflect the externalities of water use. So we'll see if that distinction is useful during the discussion. We'll have 3 presenters, as Mona and Srishti said, which will highlight some of the strengths and limitations of these pricing instruments for different types of water users. I hope the discussion can help clarify where the limitations come from. One issue, and it's a very candid question, and I really hope that the interaction with you can help us address that. Are some of these limitations essentially technical, meaning that they could be addressed through better methodologies, better data, and over the years we can gain experience and make a better use of these pricing instruments? Or are some of these limitations more foundational? Because pricing relates to some sort of worldview, a number of assumptions about property rights, about some sort of a neoliberal or neoclassical approach to water management. And we know that different cultures, different civilizations are not comfortable with that. We know that different social groups are able to manage water without pricing. So I really would like to, I really expect the discussion this morning to try to clarify some of the limitations of pricing instruments, how they can be addressed, and are they, where they come from. I hope that'll be clearer during the discussion itself. To kickstart the session, we have 3 presenters, and I will call them actually one at a time. The first one, and you have their presentations, their short bio here. So Joël Kolker from the World Bank will be the first speaker. Joël leads the Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership at the bank, which is really the think tank, the way I understand it, the think tank of the global water practice. So from that perspective, the contribution from the World Bank is really essential. And Joël will speak about tariffs for essentially water supply and sanitation services. The second speaker will be Simpiwe Ngilana from South Africa, who will bring a very different perspective. Simpiwe works for the Department of Water and Sanitation in South Africa, and his focus will be on agriculture water and how pricing instruments can contribute to or address equity issues. And the third speaker will be Vanya Vakanyan from CDP. Vanya is the Senior Global Policy Manager for Water at CDP. And in her role, she engages with policymakers, stakeholders globally to promote CDP's concept of disclosure. And in particular, CDP has done a very interesting work on internal water prices that corporates can use to reflect the value of water. So you see 3 different perspectives: water supply and sanitation, agriculture, corporate water use, which I hope will set us very well for the panel discussion. With no further ado, I would like to invite Joel to share his views and experience on tariffs for water supply and sanitation. And we'll share the same mic.
Okay, and we're going to do this in 7 minutes, I'm told, so I'm going to go very fast. I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of pricing. I'm going to talk first about subsidies, then I'm going to talk about tariffs, and then I'm going to talk about our experiences on spending the money, the public expenditure process. So let me get right into this. I think we all know what subsidies are, but basically it really occurs in the water sector when the user pays less for the product than the cost of the service. Very basic, but key to understand. Now, there we go. We've done quite a bit of analysis. We have a very big document. We don't just do these documents for the point of research, but we really try to bring them with the support of our donors, including CEDA and USAID. We work very closely with putting an analytical program together. We issue reports, but more importantly, we use the findings of those reports to have our policy dialogues with our clients at the national and subnational level. And we also embed them into our lending operations. So this is not an academic exercise. And one of the things we found out in terms of government spending on water subsidies, that it's quite a large amount of money, $320 billion, about 1.5 to 2% of GDP in the lower income countries. The challenge is that they're not addressing the poor. We found that 56% of the average of the subsidies is captured by the highest quintile. So that's pretty startling. We knew it was bad, but we frankly didn't understand that it was quite that bad. And then on average, it's only about 6% at the poorest level. Now I'm going to go faster. Subsidies, and I'm going to talk about subsidies and tariffs back and forth. We can certainly do, we can be designing them to cost less and actually do more by using them smarter, targeting them, and more efficient implementation. And there are 5 key questions here that as we start putting together subsidies, we really have to address these foundational issues. And then once we get there, there is a strategy that you can look at putting this together. And these are the key components. Now, frankly, we could be sitting here talking about subsidies for the entire week. It's a very complicated subsector, and there's a lot of critical elements in terms of putting it together. And there are different objectives in different places. Okay, this is not a cookie cutter approach by any means. So it's quite complex, and it really depends on what the public policy and what the objective is. And it can differ between utilities or local authorities. So we really have to take into consideration what our objectives are. Tariffs are a very complex structure. We could spend another week here talking about tariffs, okay? We really look at the different classifications. You look at the designs, the tariff complements that are involved in that. And then ultimately you start looking at what we've referred to, if I can see it, which I can, the tariff objectives. And this goes back, it's very similar to the subsidy objectives. And these are related, obviously. And while we have a different report on tariffs, they are very, very much they need to be done in sync. And we'll talk about that in a second. Like key messages around subsidies, there are key messages around tariffs. And you'll see some overlap here. When we did the report, it was very much around tariffs. But in putting this presentation together, I recognize that there was a lot of overlap on subsidies, and I've tried to highlight that here. The key thing is finding the right balance, and this is quite critical. We talk often about tariffs, taxes, and transfers, but you have to look at it in terms of what the costs are and how best to allocate between those. Like I said, it's quite complicated, but when it's done right, it can be very effective and is not very costly. I think that's the other objective we want to relay. We need to, as I've said, we need to strike this balance between conflicting policy objectives. We recognize that there are multiple objectives, and unfortunately, sometimes we have to prioritize what those are. And on the left, you look at some of the attributes, and then you look through the objectives, and then you have to determine your secondary objectives. Again, quite complex, but essential if you're going to use your tariffs most effectively. And then finally, I want to talk about what some people refer to as the most boring development tool in the world, which is public expenditure reviews. But they're quite revealing. This is basically how government actually spends its money, not says how it's spending its money, but how it actually does it. And we're just completing, this study hasn't been done, but we looked at about 60 plus national government budgets over about a 15 or 20-year period. And the results were a little disappointing for the water sector. And I apologize, there's a small error, but let me get to the headline. This is the spend, this is the execution of budget, all right? Human development, social education, health has a very high expenditure rate. Transportation also does quite well. Not to cut right to the chase, but if you look at water and sanitation and irrigation, we're at about 72%, not 73 as it shows. So what does this mean? It means that for every dollar we're given, we're only spending we're leaving 28 cents on the table. We are not spending public money that is allocated to irrigation and water and sanitation. So it's a little disturbing. If we increase that by 50%, our spend rate, we would need $12 billion less for each year to close the financing gap in water. So we talk a lot about private sector. We talk about the need to get more public resources in, but it's very hard to make the argument that we need more public resources when we're not executing the resources we have very effectively. And this breaks it out a little bit. This is not going to be a surprise, but this breaks it out by region. And it's no surprise that Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are leaving more money on the table than other regions. Finally, I think I usually don't end, oh, I'm sorry, somebody wanted. Sorry, okay. I wanted to leave everyone with a quote. People can't necessarily see the quote, is that what you're telling me, to read it? No. Okay, so if you can see it. This really struck me as I was going through preparing for the presentation. I really want to focus on the last sentence. So low prices have resulted in inefficient use and reduced provision and expansion of services, particularly to the poor, making the sector less attractive to investors and inflicting high costs upon the economy, society, and environment. The point being that we're not using our subsidies effectively. Our tariff structures are not being designed to serve our target populations, whatever they are. And our expenditure of the public resources that we have aren't being spent effectively. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Joel. Indeed, quite a few takeaway messages that resonate with some of our own work at the OECD. You know, and so you presented on tariffs as a source of revenue to finance water supply and sanitation services. And at the OECD, we do a lot of work on financing water. And one of our key messages is it's not essentially about more money. And as Joel said, some money is already available there, which is not being used. And the subsidiary question is the money that is being spent, is it spent effectively? That's a subsidiary question. Thanks for also flagging that prices don't come in isolation. You actually have two sides of the coin, prices and subsidies. I think that's a very important message to keep in mind, that if you consider prices as financing instruments, if people don't pay, someone will have to pay, and that would be in the form of subsidies. The challenge is that subsidies are poorly targeted and in the end are a very expensive instrument. Also, thanks for remembering us that tariff need to address conflicting objectives. So it's not straightforward, and the design of tariff is actually a very challenging issue. We'll shift gear or perspective with Simpiwe, who will join me now on the stage. Simpiwe, as I said, come from South Africa, and we focus on pricing for agriculture water. A very interesting context, and so it's great to have Simpiwe with us, who traveled a long way, and we really look forward to listening to your presentation.
This is a case study. This is a case study that I've conducted in the Eastern Cape, which is part of South Africa, one of the 9 provinces there. So my outline of my presentation, it's on South African water governance, the purpose of the National Water Act, the water allocation reform, the pricing, the case study and findings, conclusions and recommendations. And the last one will be on the limitations of pricing as a way to address equity. Now, as we all know that South Africa is very regulated, we're a constitutional country. The Bill of Rights indicate that in section 24, we need to ensure there is safe environment. And the section 27 of the Constitution talks about the healthcare, food security, water and social security. And to make effective the Constitution in 1997, the South African government has promulgated the Water Services Act for sanitation and domestic water supply. And then in 1998, the National Water Act was promulgated to give effect again to the Constitution. Now, in the National Water Act, there are these 3 values, the efficiency, sustainability, and equity, which are very fundamental in the way we distribute water. Now, the main purpose of the National Water Act are basically to protect, to ensure there is usage, there's control, there's management, there is conservation, there is development of water in a sustainable and equitable manner for the sustainability of all and for the benefit of all South Africans. Now, to give effect to the National Water Act, there was a program that was developed after 1994, where there are policies to be implemented to tackle the injustices and inequalities of the past, as we know where we're coming from as a country. Now, that program was rolled out in 2004 to ensure equitable access to water, which is take care of race and gender, and for inclusive growth, that everybody should have access to water. Now, in that program, about 3,000 of water was set aside to achieve equitable allocation of water during the Orange replanning. There was a planning study that was conducted. So a 3,000 hectares of water was meant for emerging farmers to benefit. Now, due to lack of funding commitments on land acquisition and extension of the bulk water distribution system, that adversely affected the progress and development of this project. Now, through stakeholder participation, a decision was strategically taken to allocate that water to emerging farmers, private partnerships in the form of joint ventures. Now, that was the criteria that was used, was we had emerging farmers which were to benefit 51% shares, and then 49% will be the agribusiness or the white commercial farmers that were to utilize that water. Now, there is an issue. Water pricing strategy for agriculture. In the National Water Act, section 56 to 60, it requires that the Minister of Water and Sanitation does establish a pricing strategy for water use charges. Now, in the same act, that purpose is for funding of water resource management through the water use charges, and also section 56 2B, funding water resource development and bulk water distribution infrastructure, because we need to cover those costs, hence we have to charge. So the principle is you use water, you pay for the water. Now, in 2021, I conducted a case study to examine, in one of the objectives of the study, to examine the willingness of those emerging farmers to pay for water use charges. That was the catchment that I used. We can proceed on that one. Then Basically, these are the main findings of the case study. Emerging farmers are willing to pay for water resource management. However, the water charges are too expensive for emerging farmers. Once all water users are authorized to use water, the billing begins to run, whether you have used that water or not. As long as we have authorized, the billing starts. Emerging farmers were forced to establish strategic partnerships with existing commercial enterprises through social capital, which is through their own networking mechanisms, to become members of joint ventures, which is there will be emerging farmers partnering with the joint ventures, which is with the white commercial farmers, so they can be able to utilize that water and pay the department those costs. Then this arrangement enables emerging farmers to afford to pay for water use charges to the water user association as regulated by the state, because in South Africa, we have institutions, water management institutions. So in that particular area, there is a very effective and efficient water user association, which is called Lower Sandys River Water User Association. So those emerging farmers are also members of that water user association. So emerging farmers have access to because they have a partnership now, so they are able to have access to information, to management capacity, and through the value chains, because in that particular area, water is mainly used for citrus production, which is exported across the globe. So for emerging farmers to comply to pricing policy, they need to be productive in their operations and have the capability to be efficient as well in the water use, which is a challenge, that one, because they are not productive. They don't have the resources. So the conclusions in the case study. In conclusion, it has been observed that the water allocation reform program has the potential to contribute to socio-economic development of emerging farmers if there are partnership agreements. The biggest users of water remain white commercial farmers, which contributed to South Africa being the most unequal society in the world. Pricing of water as an economic instrument does not consider status of water users. So it's not the pricing strategy as it is right now. It's not developmental, because you are being charged as long as you are authorized for water. Pricing of water run the risk of undermining the social equity goals if the issue of affordability and willingness to pay is not explicitly addressed in the agricultural sector. The recommendations. Access to water for irrigated agriculture should be taken as a production factor of the natural livelihood resources. We need to develop long-term policy instruments to better appreciate how the three values may interact to be mutually enhancing than being conflicting. Because what is happening, we have these three values, the efficiency, the sustainability, they are conflicting. They're not talking to each other, because if you want to address equity, surely the issue of economic efficiency will be at a disadvantage. So they are not talking to each other. There's a need for a policy on public-private partnerships on water governance, focusing on water and land and agricultural nexus to avoid a situation where good arrangements are being without state oversight, because that arrangement between the agribusiness or white commercial farmers were done by themselves through their social network without a policy that will be able for government to provide oversight. Now, some of the limitations of pricing, which is the last slide, policy instruments to address equity, pricing of water attempts to balance economic efficiency. However, the social equity on access to irrigation water remains not addressed. For pricing to achieve equity, state funding mechanisms designed to assist emerging farmers, poor rural and urban households to gain access to agriculture must be fully implemented. Conduct socioeconomic viability studies and investigation before, during, and after water use to avoid charging where there's no productivity. So before we authorize water use for emerging farmers, we need to conduct the status, the viability, the business plan, the issue of institutional arrangement. There's a lot of range of factors that needs to be considered before you actually give a license. So viable land reform irrigation projects. Let me repeat this. Viable land reform irrigation projects owned by women should be screened and exempted from paying water charges for a determined period to speed up equitable allocation water. That is very controversial statement, but if we want to achieve equitable allocation of water, there should be an effort for women consideration in agricultural sector, because in South Africa, we have a program on land reform and also we have a program on water allocation reform. So in order to achieve that, we need to consider women, because in this case study, although it is not listed, in this case study, women were not able to form partnerships with those commercial farmers. They are behind. As a result, they don't have access to land. But those young guys who are able, who have experience and knowledge in agriculture are the ones who are benefiting in that water, because they were able, they have the capacity and the capability to ensure that they negotiate with the commercial farmers. The last one is the state should commission impact evaluation study together with the emerging farmers to inform the review of the current water. They should not be left behind where a policy is reviewed or a strategy is reviewed or a legislation is reviewed without the information or the partnerships of those people at the lower level, I think. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simpwe. Fantastic presentation, which I think highlights a number of limitations, practical limitations we face with pricing. First point, land reform, land ownership reform should be accompanied by a reform of water allocation regimes. Otherwise, ownership of land is actually useless or valueless, and that's a fantastic lesson from South Africa. The fact that pricing, which in a sense seems to make sense, had a number of unexpected consequences, which actually contradicts the initial ambition of the reform. And I think you made it very clearly that efficiency, sustainability, and equity don't necessarily work together, and there will be trade-offs or conflicts around these different values. I really look forward to your participation in the panel because I suspect others will have more questions to you. That's a fantastic, very informative work. The third speaker is Vanya from CDP, whom I already introduced. Vanya.
Thanks very much, Xavier. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you today and to present some of the analysis we've done on our data. But before going and deeping into our findings, let me just make clear that today I'm not going to give you a review of industrial water prices as such, and going back to what Joel was referring to. And that's essentially because we know that industrial users in many jurisdictions don't pay for the water they use. So in a sense, there's an element, going back to your point of subsidies, subsidies is not just receiving money, is also not paying for the service you receive or the externalities you produce. So let me just be clear on this point. What I'm instead going to do today is to present the analysis we did on the data we collected. So for those of you not knowing CDP, we are a global environmental disclosure framework, meaning that we collect information. That is, we make the companies that respond to us fill in a questionnaire on behalf of a group of investors that give CDP the mandate to collect this information, and a group of companies. We have 3 questionnaires on climate change, forest, and water. And within our water questionnaire, which is TCFD aligned, we collect information on a variety of aspects, including business strategy. And we have one specific question on internal price on water. And that's why I'm going to cover with you today. So in essence, what we do through our questionnaire, we ask our respondents to disclose whether they apply an internal price on water, and if so, to describe to us the approach they use. We introduced this question 5 years ago, back in 2017. And at that time, 53% respondents told us that they were using internal price on water. And over the year, this number has increased. The reason why we introduced this question was essentially to be able to capture the value of water for industrial uses, knowing that without a pricing instrument, it could be undervalued. And really the idea was to follow what we were seeing at that time on the carbon sphere, and really introduce an internal pricing as a way of capturing the monetary value that businesses attach to the water they use. And the idea really of having this monetary indicator is then for them to be able to have all the information needed to inform their investment decisions. As I said, we introduced this question 5 years ago, and last year we have over 3,300 companies responded to us. So now that we have a very big data set, we wanted really to go and understand the type, how industrial users value water. So we started this journey a few months ago, having these questions, these research questions in mind. So we really wanted to understand if our respondents apply the concept of valuing water consistently, and if so, does it do their valuation practices changes across sectors? And also, we also have a geographical analysis, so we see that it also changes at regional level. Then going back to what I've heard in seminar one last week, does an internal price on water reflect multiple societal values? So that's an additional aspect I've been looking after I was invited to this talk. And you know, I'm a policy manager, so for me, really understanding the policy implication was also an important aspect to consider. So in essence, an internal price on water, in our view, and you know, according to the definition we give in our questionnaire, is not the tariff that industrial users pay for accessing the services. So it's not a water tariff or a water charge if they discharge. Rather, it's a monetary indicator, as I said before, a monetary indicator that aims to capture the value that water gives to a business. So in that respect, we see it as an indicator capturing both a costing component, in the sense that a company could value water in the sense of using this monetary indicator to capture the cost that they have to incur to secure the water they use now and in future. So it's not just a matter of being able to withdraw water now, but also ensure that it stays, the water security is there, but also all the investments needed to correct the externalities they produce or avoid future expenses. So it has this, an internal price on water can have these costing implications. But going back to the multiple societal benefit values that we discussed last week, we were also interested in seeing whether companies started to intend an internal price on water in a more broad sense. So not just as an indicator of how much water is valued internally within their boundaries, but also is a way of capturing the impacts that using water from a corporate perspective brings to the environment. So once we started analyzing the responses we get, we found that the internal price on water, the responses could be categorized into three broad categories. The first one is essentially linked to the benefits aspect I just mentioned. It is the fact that companies don't just look at their cost of securing water supply, but they also start really trying quantifying the environmental and social benefits of using water sustainably in a given catchment. The second aspect, this is the implicit pricing approach, is essentially related to the averting expenditure approach I was just mentioning. That is the fact that companies invest now to be sure they can use water on a continuous basis. And that's what surprised us. In some instances, we also see that big corporations do apply an internal fee. So although they don't pay inefficient pricing to external authorities, they charge their business units according to the water they use, and an internal price in this third aspect is seen as a sort of internal accounting mechanism. So, you know, you see that the different possibilities of using water. So what we found is that out of the 3,300 respondents to our questionnaire in general, 291 reported to us that they are using an internal price on water. And that is essentially 8% of our respondents. Interestingly, once we look at how this information is disclosed across sectors, we see that the most impacting ones are those telling us that they are using an internal price on water. So it really means that it could imply that businesses most impacted, or for which water is that value water most are more likely to disclose and to apply an internal price on water. In terms of the approach they use, what we see is that most companies intend an internal price on water as a monetary indicator derived by considering the costs that they have to incur to secure water supply, to reduce discharges, or to treat discharges, to become more water efficient. So there's a predominant element of intending the internal price on water as the cost to the business, so the value as a cost to the business. But, and this is encouraging, we also have a small percentage, 12%, which starts to consider an internal price on water as an indicator of the benefits they give to society. And we do have some examples, and it's still anecdotal evidence because we haven't yet started to analyze our data set through an in-depth analysis. But what we see is that we start seeing cases where corporations do go beyond their boundaries, and they start pricing considering the wider impacts they have on the environment they operate into. So this is the positive side of what we found. But I should also say that we also have almost a third of our respondents, that a fifth of our respondents do confuse an internal price on water with the tariffs they pay. So the concept is still a bit confused for them, and we have already planned work to improve the guidance to our companies to make sure that they disclose to us what we want them to disclose. And then we have another 18%, which says that they apply an internal price on water, but they don't say how they do that. So we don't have enough information to be able to understand how they actually do that. So in essence, and to conclude, I think really what the analysis of our data set shows us is that even in absence of an efficient pricing mechanism, there are some corporations that are proactive, and they start really thinking on, okay, I'm not paying for water, but what does it mean for my business? What if economic and financial resources do I have to commit to ensure that I can use water now and in future? So remember, the CDP disclosure framework is a voluntary disclosing mechanism. It is complementary to other economic instruments. And what our analysis, what is encouraging about this analysis is really the fact that it shows how these two instruments can work together. Obviously, as you've seen, we have an 8% of companies that disclose to us actually applying internal price on water. Obviously, we need to scale it up. And from a discussion we had yesterday with some corporations, it was clear that one of the reasons why we just have an 8% disclosure rate is that some feel it difficult, or there's no common methodological approach applied to the process. So there's a need, and it's for CDP and other NGOs or international organizations. There's a need to really clarify and to introduce frameworks or to guide corporations on this journey of valuing water, even without having a pricing instrument in place. Obviously, from a regulatory perspective, having an 8% disclosure rate implies that we can't really mandate corporations to disclose on internal price of water. But as I said, it's encouraging to see that the mentality is changing and there's more awareness. So as long as we do the journey to disclosing, to understanding the value of water for corporation easier, we do expect that corporations will be more ambitious in this respect. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Vanya, also for highlighting a category of water users which is very often absent in global discussion. We tend to talk about water supply and sanitation very often, agriculture, but corporates less often. And it's very encouraging to see that there are voluntary mechanisms in place to somehow substitute for the lack of maybe policy framework or other incentives. We're a little bit behind schedule, but we still have 40 minutes for panel discussion that will include you. So I would like to invite the speakers to come back to the stage. You'll have to stand, and please join me. And they will be joined by two new faces who will participate in the panel. Juan Velasquez, who has been very quiet so far. Juan comes from Colombia. He's both. You can join me on that table as well. Juan has two characteristics to contribute to this discussion. First, he's an academic, and he's also a design professional. And I think the combination of both can be very inspiring. Juan is doing research to understand the value of water through citizens' norms and behavior. And I think your contribution, your focus on social norms and how they actually drive behavior, in addition or maybe contradicting the economic signals provided by pricing instruments, will be very interesting. And the other new face for the panel this morning is someone most of you know or should know, Kate Lamb. She's the Global Director for Water Security at CDP, and she had a very prominent role also liaising or engaging with the climate community as the first ever high-level climate champion lead for water for the UNFCCC. That was for COP last year. So very grateful to have you on the panel. I will invite Juan to take the floor first to reflect on what you've heard, probably building on your experience with working on water values. So I'll give you we'll have to share the same mic, but that's fine.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure being here today. And well, just like for starting, I need to set the context where I am working on is specifically the domestic use of water. But at the same time, I need to recognize something important, that exists some kind of areas or levels, like the object or house, for instance. We can develop much better taps, faucets, something like that, or family, for instance, the neighborhood, a city, a company. But at the end, we have a society level, like something very, very big. I think we can all agree that water is valuable and vitally important issue today that we are facing today. Important for survival like a species, for maintaining and developing social structures, economical structures, politics, cultural structures. It's important for development and for growth. We know that, among many, many other aspects. However, although we believe in this value, we find it difficult to demonstrate in practice. So I call it this a gap between intention and action, from the individual to collective behavior, to say my focus area. We can then begin to question how we can agree across sectors to demonstrate the value of water. We need that kind of agreements. In addition to economic and political values, how can other types of values being thrown into the picture to support more comprehensive water pricing, for instance? Because I was saying that it's very rooted into the company level or industry level. Maybe we need to discuss two others values, like okay, I say it again, cultural, personal, emotional, etc. One conclusion of the OECD report from the 4 years ago caught me attention. The value of water is its conservation and the result of care as reflection of human behavior. So we can say that there is a gap between what we think and how we are acting. And well, just I was preparing some questions to the speakers too, but I will just stop for now and maybe we'll continue another time.
Sure, thank you, Juan. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm following on from, of course, from Vanya's presentation, but I founded CDP's water disclosure program 10 or 11 years ago. Some may say too long that I've been in this role, myself included at times, but I love it. And it's the power of disclosure is something that is very, I'm completely convinced. I've drunk the Kool-Aid and can see that it works. At the heart of one of the aspects of CDP's theory of change is one called the ambition loop. So demonstrating bold business and finance leadership on particular topics begets bold government ambition on those same topics. We saw this play out within the Paris Agreement, where we worked really hard to showcase that businesses were ready for carbon pricing, that they were ready for bold, ambitious Paris climate targets. And with that, alongside other partners, we achieved and contributed to a really ambitious Paris outcome. And that was a huge moment for the world, of course, and for us within the water community. I wanted to recreate that same outcome for water. And there are many different policy outcomes, policy-related gaps that we've all identified and we've all been aware of and we've all been talking about, quite frankly, for a very long time. And when I began to think about, well, what type of evidence could CDP begin to generate that could help close those gaps, that helps build an ambition loop to get governments to act on the topic? And pricing was one of those areas that was identified. And so we developed the question, I designed it, implemented it in 2017. With this, one of the sole objectives ultimately was to accelerate the adoption of internal pricing, to encourage companies to understand that they can and should be paying more for their water, so that we can then take this overwhelming group of evidence to policymakers to say the same message that we said at Paris. It is now time. Business is ready. They're already understanding and appreciating the value of water. They are already able to and willing to pay more for it. Therefore, governments be bold and start to charge them more money and therefore increase the revenue that you're generating from this resource and bring them into line to play their role. As we've seen from Vanya's presentation, we're still lacking that evidence. 291 companies is not statistically significant. So we're not there yet to be able to start making those bold statements, but we're starting. And we've got the seeds of evidence that I think we as a community can begin to use to accelerate this dialogue with policymakers. And it's my hope that by bringing this information to you today, that you can start to see it as the resource that it is and use it in a way that can help us accelerate and mature this agenda, particularly for industrial water users.
Thank you, Kate, also for going back to the origin of the program, and which actually leads me to one question to the different presenters is where do you see progress, and where do you see where the discussion, I mean, where you do see, some progress, some improvement about on how pricing can reflect some of the values of water, because I think that's an implicit assumption that the different presentations share, that pricing can actually be an instrument to reflect some of the values of water. It can work under certain circumstances, but it also faces a number of limitations. I think presentation from SIWI was quite explicit that pricing will drive efficiency, will promote efficiency as an overarching value, and that in itself can have unintended and sometimes counterproductive consequences in terms of equity and access to water. So based on your own practice, I mean, it was quite clear in the context of CDP, maybe Joel and SIWI, where do you see progress? I mean, do you see some progress? Do you see some improvements and better on how pricing better reflect the value of water? And the related question is about scaling up. as you mentioned, Vanya, I think 12% of your respondents have an internal price to water. What is required to move up, scale up? I think that was one of the points of Henk at the end of session 1, that we need to scale up. We need to get at scale. So on these two issues, where do you see progress and what would be the levels for scaling up? And then I'll stop there. Juan, I hear you have questions for the presenters, so I will actually turn to you then to ask these questions. Kate, on the progress?
Happy to go first. So while there's slow but steady progress with companies, clearly this incremental improvement is not satisfying for any of us. We know the global water crisis is pressing and urgent in almost every continent and every country. And so our ambitions must raise to the challenge and meet science where it is. At CDP, we're going to begin thinking about how we further score the data that is provided to us. So in addition to the disclosure mechanism itself, we score and rank, we allocate points to companies depending on what they disclose and how they disclose it. Those scores are then used in mainstream financial products. For example, BBVA and Iberdrola have just issued a sustainability-backed loan where the company pays a lower rate of interest if they get an A from CDP's water score. So we get that water score right. We've got a new market-based incentive to get more action on these topics. So really exciting. We think there might be more potential there to allow us to focus on the pricing piece, enhance the scoring and the information provided around that to accelerate the adoption of the topic. But this is the first time we've published or we've discussed the data in 5 years, and we've yet to publish a piece of research on it. But the intention is to do so, and with that start a more meaningful dialogue about how to price water accordingly internally so that it reflects the values. What are the lessons learned? What are the approaches currently being adopted, and how do we standardize? Where is best practice, and how do we accelerate those pieces of best practice? Are questions that we'll be exploring as a team over the next few months.
Okay. No, not at all.
Where do you see areas of progress, trends, and where do you see the next step or lever to make sure that prices better reflect the value of water?
So I guess a few reactions. Where it's positive is I think we know what we need. The components are there, whether it's the public expenditure, whether it's changes in the tariff, whether it's more efficiency in the tariffs, and certainly the discussions around subsidies and how we use them, whether it's gender, the poor, industrial policy, agricultural production, whatever it is. I think we know what the components are. I think the challenge is our data is not as good as it needs to be, and that is a huge constraint that we find across the board. Facts are facts. There's a debate about that, but facts are facts. And we sometimes, particularly at the national and subnational level, don't have very good facts in some places. So one of the things we're trying to do is make a much more robust investment in data and convincing our client countries to focus on that. It's expensive, I mean, relatively to other things, but I think it has to be done. And the result of not having that data is what you see around the subsidy results. Almost 60% of subsidies are going to the highest 20 percentile in terms of income. With better information, we could change that policy if that is the policy objective. I do think in the phrase of, every good crisis creates an opportunity, I do think that both COVID and climate have put, and even the rising interest rates have put an increased pressure on this and on water. And therefore, I think we've seen an uptake in people really trying to get the data and look at these income sources or these revenue sources to address the issues we've been talking about. So it's both, it's a mixed bag, I guess, is what I'm saying, but there are opportunities.
Thanks. And Simpiwe, in your experience, where do you see the levers that can make change happen? You mentioned the role of a bit better reflect the role of women, etc. But what would be the type of action or changes in the environment that would be needed to make a better use of pricing if need be?
Thanks. I think the most important one is the issue of implementation. The policies and the strategies that are already there in place, but there is the willingness, the capacity from the government, the institutions to implement what is already there. So we need now some more effort in terms of implementing those policies. And the most important one, because now that emerging farmers were able to establish on their own the joint ventures, we need to take it further, that initiatives that has been done by the people themselves, by having some policies developed for those institutional arrangements to be in place, so that government can be able to provide the necessary oversight, because water in South Africa is still a national and a custodian of the national department. So be that, it can't be just be a willy-nilly, or some people out there in their corners have their own arrangements. And then as government, we're not able to monitor those developments. So my main, in order to achieve equity, because in every strategy that is there, like since 2004 in South Africa, there is a strategy, national water resource strategy, which was developed. It's still up to date. The issue of equitable allocation of water has never been addressed. And now what is happening is a perpetuation of those that have to those that haven't. So there is a big gap now that needs to be fixed in terms of inequalities that are happening in the country. So a policy that would now focus not only on economic efficiency, not only on sustainability, although they are very important, but we need to take a concerted effort on the equitable allocation as a component now, so that we can be able to provide those subsidies. Because I heard it and I was very shocked to hear that we are not doing well in terms of the expenditure on irrigation and agriculture, whilst on the other hand, we are having these plethora of challenges on the other hand. So maybe we need to put our heads together now and see to it. So what can we do as the people? And what is very nice, I note now that as much as we always define water resource management as very technical, but today my take is social component, social scientists. We need to meet together, engineers to be together to be able to achieve what you have a challenge on.
Thank you. That should be music to your ears. As a so we've heard about better methods, better data, better understanding of the social dimension. Juan, you work on social norms. What's your take on that? And building on your expertise, how would you like to challenge some of the things you've heard so far?
Thank you, Xavier. I think motivation, for instance, is a determining factor to push in human behavior, to push people to change. So aspects such sensation related to pain and well, pain and pleasure, anticipation, like fear and hope, and many others aspects of motivation could help a lot. I need to understand something I think very related to the subsidies, and therefore I wonder whether subsidies are somehow connected to this kind of incentives, for instance, like motivation, or whether they provide for a sanction such as removal of subsidies in the industry sector or something like that, or even in the use, domestic use. So the question is, could be something like, who can we relate punishment or incentives to push the motivation to do something or to get something like subsidies? Question for you.
So I just want to make sure you're talking about the social pressures on subsidies?
Yes.
Okay. The short answer is yes. I mean, that's exactly what I think part of the problem is. But what are the pressures? And they change. And what does that mean in concrete terms? It's great to say we need more women farmers involved, or we have to do a better job of targeting to the poor. but there are policy implications, there are targeting implications, there are data implications. There's a whole lot of factors, and that was one of the slides I was trying to highlight. This is not, let's sit down, bring 3 people together and sit around and come up with a policy and implement it. There's also huge leadership issues around here. I mean, when elections happen, policies change, objectives change. So this is a very dynamic, fluid, complex process. And we have to recognize that as we're putting it together, has huge ramifications on public expenditure, huge ramifications on how we serve our communities, how we get to universal access. And I think we need to look very carefully and understand what the components are, as much as we focus on the end result, which is the public policy. And that's, I think, where we've gotten in trouble when we looked at this. The objectives may have been very pure and quite ambitious, but somehow we got off track despite those very good objectives. And understanding that process and understanding how it can change over time and what those change agents may be are critical to the whole process. So it is dynamic, it's complex. It has to be constantly evaluated. And where we look at good water service providers, they're doing that. They're looking at the dynamics of their service base. It's changing. COVID has changed that. We've seen more people go into poverty as a result of it. So you have to, does it mean using the same subsidy policy with a wider community, or can it be more effectively targeted? So very complex.
Thanks. I hear you a lot in mentioning the issue of motivation and incentives. And I think, again, it can be done, because if there are incentives and motivation, people will be able to pay for water. But the issue is, how do you do that motivation? How do you do those incentives? Because we understand that water is a scarce resource and it has to be paid for. But to encourage water users to pay, they should be very strongly to incentivize those. Besides subsidies, but there should be maybe rebates in terms of maybe for a certain period of time, or if you are very productive, your water use efficiency is done and it can be measured, then at least people will be encouraged, or water users, especially the big water users. There should be a plan or a policy to try and incentivize the water use efficiency.
Thank you. I hear we need better methods, better data, better policies. One point that comes to mind, that policies reflect social norms, they reflect social preferences. And so if our policies are not aligned with the ambition of pricing and tariff, it means that there is, cognitive dissonance, inconsistency between our social norms, our preferences. Are they reflected in policy frameworks and the intention of setting the tariffs right? Kate, you wanted to?
Certainly, I think recognizing that there are these policy gaps for corporations in particular, and recognizing that the way in which many multinational corporations are governed, that it's rare that you would get the way in which that company is designed and the intention of the company to grow is able to be influenced by any one national government. So a national government can influence the way IKEA's factories operate within that one country, but ultimately it's got very little influence on the way in which IKEA grows as a company overall, what it's choosing to put onto the market, what it's choosing to use as its raw materials. And IKEA are doing a really great job in working on water. I'm just choosing them because Victoria is right in my line of sight. And so the ability for a national government, even when we're getting a national water price in any one country, to then have to have an influence in such a way that changes the way in which that company chooses to grow, which is something that we all need for a water secure future, is relatively limited. So it's still, it's vital. It's an important tool for sure, but it isn't the only tool that we need to be executing from an incentive mechanism perspective. And so the secret sauce in CDP's theory of change is that it isn't CDP operating this disclosure mechanism, although we operate it, but we deliver it on behalf of a large number of financial institutions, those multinational banks and investment houses and pension funds that are the ones that can influence the way in which companies choose to grow. In fact, we operate on behalf of 680 financial institutions that control $130 trillion worth of assets. And it's their influence, their legitimacy that gives us the right to go and ask for this type of information from the firms. And we then put that data back into the heart of those investment houses so that they can use the information accordingly. And so from an incentive mechanism, the pressure, the pleasure and pain, the hope and the fear, finance understands both risk. And so we've hammered that message for the last 10 years. And in fact, the threat of water pricing, increased water pricing, is very much perceived as a risk to business right now. In some cases, though, interestingly, and this was sparked by Stu a few years ago, the lack of pricing is also viewed as a risk by many businesses. And the fact that we can draw attention to that issue, the fact that we can draw attention to the fact that a lack of regulation, a lack of enforcement in this space also threatens a business to operate in the future, provides us with another useful piece of evidence, I think, to help accelerate this agenda.
Thank you. I'll give Juan the mic for a short remark, but then I would like to invite you. You've been a very patient audience, so I'll probably have to walk around the room, and there will be people online also who may be asking questions. So I don't know, Mona, Srishti, if you have access to these questions. We'd like to take the last maybe 15, 20 minutes to get these questions. Juan.
Thank you. Well, I think that besides motivations, we have another values or another complex things to keep in mind, like information, the lack to access to the information, proper information without delay, real-time feedback, something like that, information, motivation, education, and we have something called social sharing. That means that maybe in the domestic use could be a little bit tricky to work with pricing, and something very we need to take very carefully there. For instance, in many European households, for example, the water services is not charged to the tenant, to the inhabitant, but for the owner. So maybe the inhabitant never will be aware about the price of the water. So never this motivation or this information will be reaching the population or some part of the population. So it's quite tricky talk about incentives or this kind of awards, motivation, etc., when we cannot reach the entire population. Just that reflection, sure.
Thank you. Now is the time for interaction with the floor. I saw a few hands. Because we only have one mic, I will take several questions at the same time. And so better take notes, because then you'll have to answer. Could you say just a few words who you are and then ask your questions?
Okay. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Joisa Dutra, FGV Brazil, to Joe. So we have developed a project that was commissioned by the federal government in Brazil to inform the water reform and also economic regulation moving forward. In the rate making, as per rate making, we did not manage to recommend a mechanism that would allow for decoupling, something that is in the heart of CDP's work. Decoupling between sales and profits. In your experience, did you come across several experiences of rate making that would embed decoupling?
Thank you. I think you had so Gerald, yeah, he's taking notes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Pablo Romero. I'm a consultant and I come from Colombia. So I am currently advising public utility companies in Colombia on how to introduce green investments in the tariffs. 1 year ago, I would talk to public utilities and they would not imagine increasing tariffs because it's a complex political process. So my question is for simple. I think that I said it. how was the political process for implementing the pilot that you were mentioning of the tariffs of water for agriculture? Because I think that increasing water tariffs, it's complex politically wise. It's expensive politically wise. So how did you do that?
Thanks. I think it's also a question for other members of the panel. A couple of more questions from the floor.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shruti. Joel, I have a question for you. The inefficiency in public investment is something that the data was visible for the first time for some of us, but it's something out of lived experience that we already know of, because we know that there's lack of investment and that inefficiency in investment. And at the same time, that bit around subsidies being captured by the most powerful in a country, or especially South Asia, where I come from. And I can speak to my context. And sometimes that public investment is often in contradiction with climate goals or conservation goals, and often not supporting what would be sustainable growth trajectories for those countries. And in that respect, do you think there's a possibility to redesign these perverse incentives of capturing tariffs and therefore not wanting to invest in public investment? So do you think there's a possibility to redesign? And if yes, what is it? Because that's a burning question where I come from. So thank you.
Thanks. Maybe you can pause here for the question and ask our panelists to respond. Joel, you've been on the spot.
So we were just talking about the decoupling. I'm going to come back with a question because I'm not exactly sure decoupling between what and what. So I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but let me address. The short answer is yes, it's political will. And I think what we find, in the water community, we often talk to ourselves. And I think that's a real problem. When we show this information to the ministers of finance, their reaction is, we're not putting more money into this. We geared up. One of the real advantages we have with our donors is we don't have an annual work plan. We have an evolving work plan. And when COVID struck, we were asked to up our game, and we put together a couple tools to particularly help utilities. We put up a financial tool to look at the impact of COVID in terms of both revenue, because corporate stopped, and that's the highest tariff usually, and expenditure went up because you couldn't socially distance, you had to wash your hands, and people who weren't connected to the network. So we put that together, very extensively used, and we were asked to put together a liquidity facility guidance. And we don't work very fast in the bank. There's a lot of reviews. People take our analysis quite seriously, and it goes through a very rigorous process. There were a lot of late nights, and we put together a whole guidance around liquidity facilities on the assumption that ministries of finance would start looking at this to fill the gap of COVID. Very little uptake on this. Now, for the next crisis, we have it done, but it was surprising. So we are not getting the traction to make these kind of changes at the political level. So it's not only talking to the Ministry of Finance, but also talking to other line ministries across the board. So one of the things we're doing, the gathering of the ministries of finance, one of the premier ones is our annual meetings. And this year we're doing a couple of sessions very much geared towards ministries of finance to try to make them understand better the implications of the spend, but also the implications on health and climate and everything else. So we have to stop talking to one another, get the political will, and then make the changes to tariffs and other things.
Thanks. I would like to also bring the local authorities in. I mean, keep in mind that in a number of countries, tariffs are set at local level. And so the poor design of subsidies can also, I mean, that's a message that local authorities can hear, and they can drive change here. There was a question to you, simply.
Thanks. Thanks for the question from Colombia. We have a very intensive consultation process for consultation setting in South Africa. Every year around June, July, we visit all the emerging farmers, all the water users in the country to try and determine the tariffs that needs to be set for the next financial year. So that is, once that is done, it's a submission is done, submitted to the political minister now of the department so that they can determine the actual amount that needs to be allocated. And the minister of the department, which is water and sanitation, does that tariff setting in consultation with the minister of finance, because that is being set in the pricing strategy for raw water users. So that the Minister of Water and Sanitation, and in consultation with the Minister of Finance, they have to agree on that. But yes, of course, you are right. It's very difficult to pay for the charges, especially if they are expensive. Water users will be discouraged to continue that. But again, to recover the cost of the operation and maintenance of infrastructure, a payment has to be done. And the case in point, I'm here now, standing here because of those levies that are being paid by the water users to the department so that we can be able to run efficiently the organization or the department. Thanks.
Thank you. There are 3 more questions. They are nicely located here. And I think there are 2 online, am I correct? So we'll probably go, and we'll have to stop here because of time. So can you go in succession? So introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Joelle Gordon, and I'm with Abundant Rain in Liberia, West Africa. And my question is actually for Kate and maybe Vanya as well. I'm wondering if in the questionnaire that you send out, whether or not stormwater management is included as part of that internal pricing. It was something that Victoria said yesterday about IKEA Industries and how the amount of water collected by the factories and how they deal with that, and they manage that and they send it to the rivers. With climate change, we're seeing such dramatic differences, and now more and more factories and industry are actually contributing to the flooding because they're not dealing with the stormwater.
I am Sanjeev. I spent most of my life in business, food and beverage. Last 4 or 5 years, I've been working entirely on the water crisis, and I work with and partner with many organizations. Joel, your last slide, I think, captured the challenge very vividly. And my question is, which is the country in the world which is doing the best job in terms of water pricing? And what is the biggest barrier which is preventing leaders of today, the decision makers, from making the right decision? Maybe not the most accurate decision, but making a serious progression in terms of water pricing to address some of the massive discrepancies that we're seeing around the world.
Hi, my name is Rolf Eberhard. I'm from South Africa. I want to pick up on the question of political will, because I think politics really is the elephant in the room here. And Joel, you mentioned the importance of transparency, which is obviously crucial, but I think that's a stepping stone towards something of work that we still need to do, which is to properly understand the consequences of our decisions, and to bring that into the political discourse. So there are many examples of water ministers who would have a political payoff by keeping water prices artificially low, by even reducing prices or having zero increases in a context where costs are increasing. And the payoff to them is obvious, or it's there for them, but they're making a decision because of some political payoff. But there are consequences, and often grave consequences of that, in terms of the sustainability of that sector, in terms of access, in terms of poor people having access to water, etc. And we've got a fascinating case study now in gas prices. So before Ukraine war, gas pricing was uncontroversial, right? And now suddenly, with the huge spike in costs and affordability issues, suddenly it's become very political. And we have a fantastic case study now of how politics responds to that, because that's what water has been dealing with all the time, right? And we'll see the trade-offs being made, and which countries will make better choices related to that based on the understanding of the consequences over time. So I think we can learn a lot from the current context for water. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I'm lazy, I'll give the floor to Vanya. First question to you, stormwater.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Kate, but if I remember it, yeah.
Only because Vanya's still very new to the organization, doesn't know the questionnaire substantially. So yes, the threat that you're recognizing or articulating, and although it's not related to pricing, is one around the steps companies are taking to manage stormwater and the implications of that for flooding, not only for themselves, of course, but for local communities. And there's a devastating example recently emerged from Malawi, where a company who at this stage has to remain nameless implemented flood management for themselves, for their own site, but inadvertently created a huge flood that killed many people in a village in Malawi in the middle of the night. And it was a devastating and, of course, unintended consequence of that business's activities. But they had unfortunately designed those flooding solutions for themselves without full consideration of the local communities around them. And of course, this is a very dramatic example, but it is one that could, and no doubt is, being repeated around the world, because companies, a number of them, most that are here at Stockholm, are completely converted. You get it, but you are not the norm. The norm are that businesses still very much operate as clean fish in dirty ponds, and that's a thing that we need to address, and we do attempt to do that within the questionnaire. But of course, disclosure isn't the silver bullet, and to speak to Rolf's point, it is a means to an end. It isn't the end within itself, but it is a vital tool shining a light on the vital pieces of information, such as that shared by Joel, is a really important step to gaining progress. It allows us to not only understand the problem, but then to track progress against addressing the problem. And I think there was something else I wanted to say to Rolf's point, and it's completely gone. So I'll hand back to Joel, and then no doubt, hopefully it will reoccur to me. But yes, thank you for raising it.
Okay, so, sorry. Yeah, I'm not going to answer that. Sorry. I will say there are components to the answer, though. I mean, there are some countries that are doing subsidies much better than others. You can even break it down to collection rates. I mean, we're very fortunate on the water and sanitation side in that we have key performance indicators. We run a database of 5,000 utilities, self-reporting. You go on there, you look at some of the utilities and you look at some of those numbers and you have to scratch your head. So this goes to the data point, right? We've got to have clear, transparent, and hard data. And we're missing that in many places. So it's very hard then to develop tariffs. It's very hard to do effective subsidies. It's easier to look at public expenditure, but in some places you can't do a public expenditure review. It's classified. So shining some light there is a difficult process. I mean, we go into some places and we can get a public expenditure review done in a couple months. We go into other places and, the bodies are still there. It can be a very protracted process. So I think, to answer your question more broadly, again, I'm going to repeat myself, data, leadership, political will, these are all very soft kind of things, but I think they're very vital to what we've done. I cannot do justice to these 3 reports, and I don't want to make a plug for World Bank report, but there's an extensive amount of country-based data on the subsidy study, the tariff study, and the soon to be released, public expenditure review. And it's, we struggled with this because we wanted to do a subsidy and tariff study together. And we started getting into this, and there was so much in there that we had to pull it apart. Pulling it back together again, I think, is one of the things we need to do, and now adding the public expenditure. Rolf, on your question on specifically around tariffs, I think you're right. I think if you really look at what's happened with energy tariffs, I worked in the energy sector before I came to water a million years ago, and everyone was worried about raising energy tariffs, right? The price of energy, we couldn't do it. They were poor. We had to come up with subsidies. The energy crisis hit, demand went through the roof. We raised prices. There's a lot more people getting energy today than there were before. It's a sector we need to look carefully at and really understand what the implications on that are. I am not saying, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying we should raise tariffs and that's the solution. And that's what we need to do. But we do need to look at all of these revenue sources, and I hesitate to even call them revenue sources, but they're components coming into this, and you can adjust them accordingly. I mean, if I am not advocating for this, but there are places that do universal healthcare. There are places that do universal pre-K funded by the Treasury, by the fiscus. If that is a public policy, you go off to the Ministry of Finance and say, right, this is where we need the money, and it takes care of pressure on subsidies and other things. On the other hand, if the public policy is this all has to be done through tariffs and we want to be done with subsidies, there's implications for that too. And there's ways to look at doing it. So I guess what I'm really saying is this is complex. It's very politically sensitive. It's not just done by a utility. That's at the heart of it, or the server or local government, but it is a dynamic process with a lot of different inputs that are going to differ from different communities at different times. So I hope I did some justice to that.
Thank you. We have to wrap up because I'm conscious of time. Just to add a little bit of dissent, I would like to challenge this notion of political will, which I think is an easy way, political will, which I think is an easy way to say, I don't know. And I would like to go back to the point we raised earlier, that policies reflect social norms. And I think we should probably spend more time investigating social norms that actually prevent us from doing what we preach or what we think we should be doing, instead of blaming the lack of political will, which I think remains a very elusive concept. No, you can't. But we can go on over a beer later on. For the last 5 minutes, I would like to put my colleague Aude on the spot to ask her, probably not to wrap up everything that you've heard, but maybe highlight some of the few points you heard and you found useful.
So first, thank you to all the speakers and panelists for this very inspiring session. So as Xavier said, I will not give an exhaustive summary of this very rich discussion, as many points were raised, many very interesting points. The ones that particularly caught my attention were the following. So we've seen in the presentation the point of view of the water and sanitation sector, the agriculture and the industry, the corporates. We've seen different instruments, how they are working, but also their limits, because they addressed conflicting objectives, economic efficiency, affordability, equity, which are not always compatible. And there's the question of the trade-offs among these conflicting objectives. So tariffs can raise issues of affordability, charges can raise issues of equity, as we have seen with the case of South Africa, and subsidies, there's issues of efficiency, so it sometimes misses its target. And in the case of the internal price on water, we've seen that it has limited application since several years for some reasons. So why these instruments are limited, why they do not always reflect the multidimensional value of water? Is it due to technical and methodological issues such as the lack of data, or are there more fundamental problems, and which one? So it's probably a bit of both, as we've seen with our speakers and panelists. And then what are the levers and the areas of progress? So we've seen that it's not only about a lack of money, but it can be also about how we use this money efficiently. We've seen that improving budget execution could be an option. Improving it by 50% could actually fill the financing gap in water by around 12%, if I remember well. We've seen that there's an issue of a gap between intention and action, from individual to collective action, a gap between what we think and how we act, and a solution to that could be motivation to push social behavior, social change, and motivation can pass through incentives. In terms of incentives, we've seen the example of scoring mechanism to incentivize corporate to be more active on the water disclosure. We've seen that bold leadership and bold ambition can be also a solution. We've seen that there's some methodological issues, so we need to introduce framework to guide, for instance, corporate on valuing water. We've seen that we can also invest more on data, and that sometimes, and maybe too often in the water community, we talk to ourselves, and we could talk even more to other sectors, including the finance community. So to conclude, there's a question of better method, better data, better policies, and issues of leadership. So I'll stop there because we are running out of time, but thank you again for this very inspiring and interesting session.
Thank you, Aude. I would like to thank again the young professionals who Mona and Srishti, who have been very helpful throughout. The speakers, the panelists, you have been a patient but also active audience, people online. Just want to highlight that this is not the end of this conversation of pricing. Session 3 of the seminar is right now, and it starts in half an hour in the auditorium. Stu, am I correct? Musical, sorry. So please, if you want to follow the conversation till the end, join us to the music hall. Their role will be to provide the answers and the solutions to all these simple questions. So no pressure, Stuart.
Governance issues at 12:30 at the bank booth, which we're releasing on public expenditure. Policies, institutional and regulatory reforms. So
that's it's the sales pitch. Thank you.